A lowly Amazon employee is ignored by her boss until a millionaire shows up and completely changes her destiny. The Amazon cafeteria was filled with voices mingling with the clatter of metal trays. In the corner, Emily was wiping tables with hands still scarred from the strain of the packing line. Her gloves were torn, her blouse stained with coffee someone had spilled on purpose. Laughter echoed through the room when one of the supervisors, wearing a suit too expensive for the environment, deliberately dropped $100 bill on the floor. "Take it. It must be worth more than your entire shift," he said dismissively. Emily hesitated, not from the lure of the money, but from the weight of the stares. Everyone expected her to bow, to acknowledge her humiliation. When she didn't, the jokes came, sharp as knives. "Poor people's pride doesn't pay the bills," someone shouted. Emily remained silent, her eyes teary but upright. In that moment, it was as if the entire room had united to crush her, and she alone was forced to bear the mark of public contempt. That same night, a silent black car pulled up in front of the main entrance. The glass doors opened, and to everyone's astonishment, Michael Carter, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the United States, stepped out. He entered without lawyers or security, but walked straight to the employee area. Eyes turned, and the supervisor who had earlier laughed at Emily froze, trying to fake a smile. But Michael paid him no attention. He stopped in front of Emily, still holding the cleaning cloth, and said something that transformed the air into pure disbelief. "I finally found you." A murmur spread through the room. Emily, surprised, let the cloth slip from her hand. This man, whose face graced magazine covers, seemed to know her. The laughter suddenly stopped, replaced by an almost palpable tension. No one understood what was happening, but everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. The vast Amazon warehouse in New Jersey felt like a city within a city, with its never-stop conveyor belts, boxes stacked like buildings, and employees moving at an almost mechanical pace, always controlled by clocks and supervisors watching like sentries. The air smelled of cardboard and dust, mixed with the faint aroma of stale coffee wafting from the pantry, where few had time to stop. There, everyone wore the same yellow vest, but some stood out not for their job, but for their invisible power to command, order, and humiliate. It was in this setting that Emily lived her days, always with a firm gaze and a steady breath, as if she had learned to bear the weight of routine. Despite her youth, her face bore traces of accumulated fatigue, but also a silent strength that few noticed. To most, she was just another girl, the girl who cleaned, who collected what was left, who went unnoticed until someone decided to make her a laughingstock. The supervisor, Jonathan Miller, was known for his threatening tone of voice and his well-pressed suit, which clashed with the industrial environment. He liked to remind everyone that he wasn't one of them, that he'd risen in the world, and therefore had the right to step on anyone he considered inferior. And Emily, with her humble demeanor, became his favorite target. All it took was an untimely pause, a slowed gesture, an inattentive glance, and there he was with sharp phrases that drew laughter from those afraid to cross him. That particular morning, the mood seemed heavier than usual. The rain beat heavily against the tall windows, and the cold light from the lamps reflected off the polished floor, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. Emily was walking down the hallway carrying a stack of boxes when she heard, once again, the voices behind her. "Look at that, the little princess of the warehouse," mocked a co-worker seeking the supervisor's favor. Jonathan soon appeared, with the same air of practiced arrogance. "Little princess? She can't even build a cardboard castle properly," she said, drawing laughter from some. Emily didn't respond. She'd already learned that silence, while it didn't protect her, was the only way to avoid further humiliation. Her footsteps echoed on the damp floor as she entered the cafeteria to complete another task. quickly clearing the tables before shift change. The room was crowded, noisy, filled with clanging trays, mingling voices and employees. Laughing loudly to forget that life was made of exhausting repetition, she moved between the tables like a shadow, discreetly, trying to finish before anyone noticed her presence. But it was impossible to go unnoticed. The same group, surrounded by a larger table, laughed when she dropped a napkin. It wasn't a serious mistake, but here, any slip-up became a spectacle. Jonathan, seated in the center as if he were a king on his makeshift throne, watched everything with the eyes of a predator. He seemed to feed off the tension he created. "Careful, Emily, don't trip over your own pride," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The laughter erupted again, and for a moment Emily felt as if each laugh were an arrow piercing her skin. But she continued, focused, picking up the leftover food, brushing away the crumbs without raising her head. The entire cafeteria was a stage, and she, against her will, was the character who always bore the brunt of the ridicule. Outside, the rain grew louder, as if the world silently watched this scene of contempt. But no one imagined that this routine, about to repeat itself like so many others, held a turning point. Something that would break the cycle of humiliation, revealing that, behind the invisible girl, lay a story much greater than anyone could imagine. Emily was born in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, in a house barely standing, with loose floorboards and walls that creaked whenever the wind blew stronger. Her father, a man marked by alcoholism, disappeared for good when she was just 6, leaving behind not only debts but also invisible scars that would shape the girl's childhood. Her mother, frail in health, did her best to support them both by working as a housekeeper in family homes. But with each harsh winter, she seemed to shrink in the face of the hardships, until one day she simply couldn't resist. 12-year-old Emily found herself alone in the world, penniless, without close relatives, and with her childhood ripped away prematurely. She passed through temporary shelters, endured nights when the cold seemed to penetrate her bones, and learned early on that silence was the best way to survive. While other children dreamed of dolls or bicycles, she dreamed only of a warm blanket and a meal uninterrupted by the fear of missing the next. As a teenager, she worked wherever she could, cleaning yards, washing cars, caring for children who had so much more than she had ever known. She always watched those large houses from afar, with their lit windows and the smell of cooking wafting through the doors, wondering what it was like to live in a place where pain wasn't the norm. Over time, she developed a rare skill, the ability to observe without being noticed. This same skill kept her alive, avoiding fights, insults, and even indecent proposals from men who saw only vulnerability in her. Emily grew up carrying on her shoulders a kind of silent resilience, an invisible strength. That wasn't announced in words, but rather in each time she managed to endure another day. At 18, she landed a steady job at an Amazon warehouse, a place that for many was just another cog in the wheel of exploitation, but for her meant a roof over her head and a salary that could guarantee food and perhaps some future. It was in that environment that she realized two things. First, that she would always be seen as the poor girl who should be grateful for the bare minimum. Second, behind the metal walls and endless corridors, there were people who used hierarchy as a weapon to crush others. Jonathan, the supervisor, appeared in her life precisely at this point, a cruel reminder of everything she had already faced. He seemed to recognize her fragility, like a predator sniffing out the wound of its prey, and she, even trying to build an invisible wall around herself, couldn't prevent the constant humiliation from leaving its mark. But there was something about Emily that no one knew. She had never forgotten the words her mother had said to her shortly before she died. "You will be greater than all this, my daughter. Never bow to those who try to diminish you. The world will try to crush you, but remember, those who suffer in silence carry within them a strength no one imagines." These words became her mantra, even if repeated only in her mind, in the cold corridors of the warehouse, in the moments when she choked back tears, on the nights when she returned alone to the small rented room with peeling walls. It was as if her mother was still there, reminding her that there was something greater hidden, even if no one else could see it. Emily learned to smile from within, even when the world wanted to see her break. And it was precisely this past, woven of poverty, abandonment, and pain, that shaped her for the unexpected encounter that would change not only her life, but also that of the man she never imagined meeting in that same warehouse. It was Friday, the day of goal-setting at the warehouse, when the atmosphere seemed even more suffocating. Supervisors walked like generals on a battlefield, taking notes, observing, and measuring the workers' every step. Jonathan, dressed in a grey suit that stood out even more in the dusty, sweaty environment, used these days to reinforce his power. He liked to turn pressure into a spectacle, and that day, Emily was the perfect opportunity to feed his ego. In the cafeteria, during the collective break, the group closest to him gathered around a table. Among them were young people who saw in Jonathan a model of success, someone who had made it from the same ranks of hard labor. What no one knew, or pretended not to know, was that his success was more linked to arrogance than merit. With a cup of coffee in hand, Jonathan launched into a provocation. "Anyone bet I can make the warehouse princess kneel for money?" The laughter echoed, quick, complicit, full of that wickedness varnished with amusement. One of the boys hesitated. "Emily, that one doesn't even open her mouth when someone calls her trash. I doubt she'll bow." Jonathan smiled, adjusting his tie as if accepting a challenge. "You'll see. Everyone has a price, even her." The brief silence that followed was broken by a sharp snap, the $100 bill being placed on the table, folded precisely, as if it were a loaded gun. Emily entered the cafeteria at that moment, carrying a tray of food scraps to be thrown away. She didn't immediately notice the eyes that turned her way, but she felt the change in the air. Jonathan stood up slowly, theatrically, and dropped the bill on the floor, right in front of her. The sound of the paper sliding across the polished floor seemed to be amplified amid the hubbub. "Hey, Emily," she said loudly, feigning cordiality, "I think you dropped this. It's more than you make in 2 days, isn't it?" Eyes fixed on her. Some chuckled, others watched expectantly. It was as if the entire cafeteria had become an arena. Emily stood still for a second, her eyes fixed on the note. She knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't an offer. It was a trap, a way to turn her into a spectacle, to elicit laughter as she knelt before everyone. Her heart raced, her throat dry. But the memory of her mother's words echoed in her mind like an anchor. She took a deep breath, stood up straight, and continued walking, ignoring the money on the floor. The simple gesture, however, further inflamed the audience. Jonathan, irritated, persisted. "Are you going to leave it there? $100, that's more than your weekly rent, I imagine." The collective laughter grew, almost deafening. Emily stopped again, turned slowly, and stared at Jonathan. She didn't say a word, but her silence was louder than any answer. Yet for the group, the silence was interpreted as insolence. "Poor man's pride," someone shouted. The laughter echoed like gunshots. Jonathan spread his arms wide, as if he were a host on his own show, savoring the humiliation he thought he had inflicted. But behind Emily's teary eyes, there was something different that night. Not just pain, but a quiet steadfastness, a refusal to break. What no one imagined was that, at that moment, fate was already preparing the next scene, where the weight of that cruel bet would fall not on her, but on the very man who had engineered it. The cafeteria was still filled with murmurs and muffled laughter when the automatic doors slid open with a metallic clang. The cold, rain-soaked wind rushed in, bringing with it an unexpected presence. Michael Carter strode across the room as if carrying an aura that distorted the room. Tall, impeccably dressed in a black overcoat, he seemed out of place in that industrial space. Eyes turned like magnets, and even Jonathan, who until seconds before had reigned supreme, swallowed hard when he realized who had just entered. Conversations ceased. It was as if time itself had paused. Emily, still standing, holding the cleaning cloth against the table, didn't immediately understand why everyone was so still. Then, a deep, calm voice cut through the silence. "I finally found you." The whole world seemed to lose its footing. Jonathan tried to step forward, forcing a smarmy smile. "Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you here in our humble warehouse. I'm Jonathan, General Supervisor." But Michael ignored him completely. His eyes were fixed solely on Emily. The cloth slipped from her hands, and for a moment it felt like she was breathing for the first time in a long time. "You're Emily?" he asked, without raising his voice, but so firmly that everyone heard. She nodded slowly, confused, unsure of what this man, whose face she'd seen in newspapers and financial magazines, could possibly want with her. Jonathan laughed nervously, trying to regain control. "Her? She's just an employee, nothing special, sir. I'm sure she came looking for someone from management." Michael then took a step forward, approaching Emily. His expensive shoes contrasted sharply with the stained floor, but he walked as if nothing could stop him. When he stopped in front of her, he lowered his voice slightly, as if he wanted to speak only to her, even if everyone could hear. "I've been looking for you for months." The shock was immediate. The cafeteria, which had previously laughed at her, now seemed like an audience unable to blink. Emily opened her mouth, but found no words. Her heart was beating too fast, and the only thing she could think was that there had been some mistake. Michael Carter, the millionaire who ran one of the largest investment firms in the country, couldn't be there because of her. Jonathan, already red with anger and nervousness, tried to intervene. "Sir, let me explain. Emily is just a simple employee. Maybe someone gave her wrong information." Michael looked up at him, and in just a second of silence, Jonathan recoiled, feeling the invisible weight of authority. Then Michael turned to Emily and said something that left everyone breathless. "Your mother. She helped me when I had nothing. I promised I would take care of you." The sentence fell like an explosion. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The voices around her turned to whispers of disbelief. The supervisor, who had previously humiliated her, seemed to shrink in his chair, unable to meet the millionaire's eyes. And Emily, who for years had carried loneliness as her only companion, now found herself faced with a revelation that reopened the wounds of the past and, at the same time, lit a spark of something she had never had: hope. The impact of Michael's words echoed like thunder between the cafeteria walls. The employees, previously complicit in the laughter against Emily, now glanced at each other uneasily, as if realizing for the first time that they had witnessed something much bigger than a simple, cruel joke. Jonathan, feeling his authority slipping through, his fingers desperately tried to regain control of the situation. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, there must be a misunderstanding. This girl, well, she's nothing more than a common worker. You can't be referring to her." The tone slipped between flattery and venom, but no one else seemed convinced. Michael, however, remained firm, staring at Emily as if there were no one else in the room. She, paralyzed, felt the eyes piercing her skin like spears. Suddenly, Jonathan, overcome with rage at losing the stage, raised his voice. "Look, everyone here knows Emily is a laughingstock, always has been. How many times have we seen her trip, spill trays, forget chores? You, a man of your standing, can't imagine someone like that has any value." The silence that followed was more violent than the previous laughter. Jonathan exposed himself before everyone, showing that cruelty wasn't just a game, but a vice that defined him. Emily, her eyes brimming, didn't know if the pain came from the words or from hearing it so openly, without masks, without disguise. It was as if her dignity had been stripped away once again, this time in front of someone who saw her differently. Michael remained still, but the ice in his gaze cut through Jonathan like a blade. "Watch your words," he said, his tone low but thick with menace. "People reveal their true selves when they think no one important is watching." Jonathan swallowed hard, but still didn't back down. Wounded pride made him insist. "With all due respect, sir, but you can't expect us to treat a simple cleaning lady as someone important. You're wasting your attention." At that moment, Michael didn't need to respond. The very weight of the sentence fell on Jonathan like a sentence. His colleagues, who had previously been laughing, now looked away, some embarrassed, others simply afraid of being on the wrong side. Emily then realized she was no longer just the victim of humiliation. She was witness to a silent downfall, a reversal of power that was beginning to unfold before everyone's eyes. Yet the contempt still stung. Because even with Michael's unexpected defense, Emily felt exposed, naked before the collective cruelty. Her eyes lowered for a moment, not out of submission, but because bearing so many gazes at once was unbearable. Jonathan, breathless and unaware of how much he had already lost, released one last poisoned arrow. Pride doesn't fill the stomach. You can feign dignity, Emily, but deep down we all know you'd give anything to be in the right place with the right person. The words hung in the air, dirty, sharp, and Emily took a deep breath, holding back the pain in her chest. She didn't respond, didn't give in. She simply stood, as she always had. But in that moment something changed forever. The humiliation meant to crush her would, later on, be the very flame that would reveal the fragility of the man who believed himself invincible. Tension hung in the air, like a taut rope about to snap. Michael stood before her, steady, while Jonathan still tried to disguise his own fall with forced smiles. Emily, however, took a deep breath. Something inside her, dormant for years of silence, finally rose. Her tear-filled eyes met Michael's, and to everyone's surprise she spoke aloud for the first time, unwavering, clear as a blade cutting through the darkness. "I always knew." The sentence reverberated through the cafeteria, leaving everyone in a state of confusion. Jonathan frowned, unable to understand. Michael remained still, attentive. Emily lifted her shoulders, as if finally freeing herself from a weight that had crushed her since childhood. "My mother told me before she died. She told me about a young man she helped, a lost man who had nothing, and the promise he made to never forget. I knew he would return someday. I just didn't know when." The cafeteria fell into absolute silence. The laughing employees now held their breath, unable to believe that this girl who had so often been the butt of jokes was carrying such a big secret. Jonathan laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Lies. Stories of poor people trying to feel important. But his voice no longer held any power. Emily turned to him, and for the first time spoke directly. "You never understood anything. You never realized that every humiliation you tried to use against me only made me stronger. I knew who I was. I knew what my mother had done. I knew life would change. Was just waiting for the moment." The words fell like stones, and for the first time Jonathan had no answer. The usual contempt in his eyes gave way to a void that betrayed fear. Michael then smiled almost imperceptibly, as if finally finding confirmation of something he'd always believed. "So you knew," he said quietly, not in surprise, but in admiration. Emily took another deep breath, and her posture changed. She was no longer the invisible employee. She was someone who carried within her the memory of a promise made decades ago, someone who had endured the darkness knowing that one day the light would reach her again. And everyone, silent witnesses to that revelation, realized that the girl they thought was fragile had always been aware of her role. It wasn't chance that placed her there, it was destiny. Emily's words still echoed in the air when Michael took a step back, not out of distrust, but like someone struck by an old, sudden memory. He lifted his face, as if searching. The high ceiling of the warehouse for confirmation of a past he'd tried to hide from the others, but which was now surfacing for all to see. The heavy silence in the cafeteria only increased the tension. Jonathan, pale, no longer dared interrupt. Everyone waited for an answer, a thread that would connect the pieces of that puzzle. Michael took a deep breath before speaking, and his voice was thick with suppressed emotion. "Your mother. It was Anna. I met her when I was only 20, lost. Homeless with debts that dragged me down into the mud. She fed me when no one else cared. She let me sleep on the couch in your living room for weeks. She was the first person to believe I could be anything other than a failure." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, and tears streamed discreetly down her face. Her mother's name, spoken by that powerful man, seemed to rekindle childhood memories she treasured. Anna's soft laugh, the smell of plain coffee at dawn, the way he said everyone had a hidden flame within. Michael continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I promised her that night I left to try my luck in New York that I would never forget. I said if I ever made it, I would come back to take care of you. I spent years searching, but life swallowed me up, business grew, and when I finally returned, Anna was gone. The only thing left was the guilt of not having kept my promise. The words fell like stones on Emily's heart. She had always known the promise, but hearing it from his mouth in front of everyone gave real weight to something that until then had lived only in her memory. The employees, involuntary witnesses, now cringed, some visibly embarrassed at having participated in the humiliations. Jonathan, unable to hold her gaze, looked away as if searching for a hole to disappear into. Emily, however, lifted her face and stared at Michael. I knew you existed. She told me about a boy she called Destiny's Child. She said one day he would return, and I waited. I waited all these years, even when it seemed impossible. Their gazes locked as if the rest of the world had disappeared. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle finally fell into place, revealing that it was no coincidence, but an invisible thread that had always connected their stories. Michael felt the weight of the revelation, not just as a memory, but as a spiritual debt, a mark that could never be ignored. He no longer saw the humble employee who cleaned tables. He saw the daughter of the woman who had given him a second chance at life. And in that moment, before all who had previously ridiculed her, Emily ceased to be invisible. She became someone who carried within her the truth that could tear down masks, reveal weaknesses, and reverse roles forever. In the days following the unexpected encounter, the entire warehouse seemed to be in suspense. Conversations in the hallways no longer revolved around goals or shifts, but about Emily and the millionaire who had sought her out in front. Serve everyone. However, when Michael returned the next morning, determined to find her, he received news that surprised him. Emily had disappeared. She hadn't resigned, hadn't notified anyone. She simply hadn't returned. The empty locker, the badge left on the table, the absolute absence. It was as if she had been swallowed by silence. Jonathan, humiliated by the scene in the cafeteria, tried to feign indifference, but the truth is that her absence haunted him too, because without her presence, there was no longer a target for his displays of power. But for Michael, the disappearance had a different weight. For the first time in years, he felt the unease of loss, a void that couldn't be filled with million-dollar contracts, meetings in skyscrapers, or trips on private jets. Amid the luxury of his Manhattan penthouse, the silence seemed deafening. He stared at the illuminated city through the glass window, but all he could think about was the young woman who had walked away before he could even explain everything he felt was necessary. The memories came flooding back. Anna's image, her selfless kindness, the worn sofa where he had slept when he had nothing. Emily wasn't just her daughter. She was the continuation of a promise, the living presence of a debt he hadn't repaid. And now, with her departure, he seemed to have lost the chance to make amends. Michael sent people to search. He scoured records, tried to track down any clue. But Emily, as if he had always planned it, disappeared without a trace. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling destinies and manipulating numbers, discovered how powerless he was in the face of absence. He missed her not out of curiosity or vanity, but because of something deeper, something that gnawed at his chest on nights when he lay awake. It was as if he had rediscovered a forgotten part of himself, only to see it slip away again. And for the first time, he began to realize that true power lay not in the millions he had accumulated, but in the presence of someone who, with a simple, silent look, could dismantle all his certainties. The weeks progressed like an invisible storm, and Michael Carter, accustomed to dominating financial headlines with multi-million-dollar acquisitions and bold investments, began to dominate opinion columns for a completely different reason. The cafeteria video, secretly recorded by an employee, went viral on social media. It clearly showed Jonathan throwing the bill on the floor to humiliate Emily, followed shortly after by Michael's arrival, defending her in front of everyone. But what should have been a gesture of grandeur turned into a public trial. The images were edited, interpreted, and questioned. Headlines appeared. Why does a billionaire care about an anonymous employee? Is Michael Carter hiding a dark secret? Power and manipulation in the corridors of Amazon. The entire country seemed to be weighing in, his every word dissected by scandal-hungry journalists. The elite who had previously applauded him began to grow suspicious. In board meetings, glances were thrown like knives, veiled questions about his emotional stability, about his personal choices. The man who had always been seen as unshakable was now questioned for acting in defense of someone considered irrelevant in the eyes of society. Jonathan, capitalizing on the backlash, tried to portray himself as the victim, claiming that Michael had invaded his work environment and embarrassed the team. But the strategy didn't last. Testimonies soon emerged from employees denouncing years of abuse, shouting, humiliation, and manipulation. Jonathan's public downfall was swift and inevitable, but unexpectedly, some of the burden also fell on Michael. The press voraciously exploited the narrative, the millionaire involved with a poor employee, charity, or something more. Social judgment came not in court, but on the streets, on screens, in the suspicious looks he received, even from close allies. Invitations to events were cancelled, business deals frozen, and anxious investors threatened to back out. For the first time, Michael felt the bitter taste of collective distrust, the same distrust Emily had carried her entire life without ever being able to defend herself. And amidst this turmoil, he realized how vulnerable he had become, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had finally shown something true. In her absence, his image was crumbling. The world seemed to punish him not for the fortune he had amassed, but for the human gesture he had dared to make in public. And this cruel irony, this silent karma, gnawed at him night after night, transforming each headline into an uncomfortable mirror of his own soul. Michael Carter, once known for his calculated coldness and his constant focus on numbers, began to change from the inside out. The public judgment he suffered didn't destroy his wealth, but it shook something much deeper, the unshakable pride that had always guided him. Sleepless nights became routine. He walked alone through his luxurious apartment, his eyes running over every detail of marble, crystal, and steel, and everything seemed empty. There was no longer any meaning in the expensive wine, the tailored suits, or the million-dollar contracts that piled up on the table. For the first time, Michael understood what it meant to have no control. In the silence of the early morning, he remembered Anna, and how a simple bowl of soup she offered him had given him more dignity than all the meetings in mirrored rooms. And then he thought of Emily, of the silent gaze that faced humiliation without breaking, of the courage disguised in silence that she carried like an invisible crown. He began visiting places he had forgotten, the poor neighborhoods he had once left, shelters filled with nameless faces, faces that reminded him of his own lost youth. He left anonymous contributions, but realized that money didn't heal the biggest wound, her absence. His closest friends noticed the change. He was no longer the same arrogant man who arrived at parties surrounded by applause. Now, when he appeared, he had a disturbing melancholy in his eyes. In corporate boardrooms, he refused to approve projects that exploited workers. He confronted executives with firm speeches about dignity and respect, surprising even allies who had always seen him as a symbol of cold ambition. What had once been strategy became conscience. It was as if his encounter with Emily had ripped the blindfold from his eyes and revealed the humanity he had stifled in the name of financial glory. And while the world commented on his supposed weaknesses, Michael understood that there was no greater weakness than living without a soul. Every step he took now was a reckoning with the past, a path toward something he couldn't buy. But deep down, he knew that every transformation would only be complete if he found Emily again. She was the key, not because she represented a debt, but because she symbolized the truth he had denied for so long, that nothing was worth more than the courage to remain human in a world that sought to crush the weak. Months of silent searching led him to a small rural town, far from New York's skyscrapers and Amazon's noisy factories. Michael got out of his car on a narrow street lined with simple wooden houses where time seemed to slow down. A light rain fell, soaking his coat, but he didn't care. He followed the signs to a small community library, almost hidden between two old shops. He entered slowly, the smell of aged paper and dust mingling with the soft aroma of freshly brewed coffee. And there she was, Emily, sitting behind a makeshift table, reading stories to a group of children who watched her with bright eyes. The contrast was overwhelming. She, who had always lived in the shadows of humiliation, now radiated light, her calm voice holding every gaze, her presence filling the space with something no amount of money could buy. Michael stood still, watching her for a few moments, unable to interrupt this sacred moment. When the children finally dispersed, Emily looked up and saw him. Time seemed to freeze. There was no shock, no anger, just a silence heavy with memories and still open wounds. He took a step forward, hesitant, vulnerable as never before. "You disappeared," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Emily took a deep breath, closing the book. Slowly, "I needed to disappear. I needed to remember who I was without you, without old promises, without the weight of your guilt." The words cut like a knife at first, but they were also true, and Michael knew it. He leaned closer, his eyes fixed on hers, trying to find a space for forgiveness. "I searched everywhere for you, not because I owed you anything, but because I missed you. For the first time in my life, something was missing, and it wasn't money or power. It was you." Emily looked away, and a silent tear ran down her cheek. She wanted to resist, wanted to remember the nights she swallowed her shame alone, but before him, she realized something had changed. He was no longer the cold, distant man she'd imagined. He was someone broken by absence, transformed by loss. Their reunion wasn't marked by hugs or declarations, but by that shared silence, laden with everything that didn't need to be said. And in that exchange of glances, Michael understood that the decision was no longer in her hands. Her destiny now belonged to her. Their reunion had left the air heavy with silence, as if even the walls of the small library were waiting for her choice. Michael, vulnerable as never before, stood before Emily without the shields of money or authority. For the first time in his life, he had no arguments, no power. Everything depended on a single word from her. Emily took a deep breath, looking at him with a mixture of pain and tenderness. She no longer saw the millionaire depicted in magazines. She saw the man who carried in his eyes the weight of guilt and loneliness. But she also remembered the nights she swallowed humiliations without anyone to defend her, the years she survived alone, while he, in some distant skyscraper, forgot the promise he made to her mother. Her heart wavered between the impulse to forgive and the need to protect herself. Michael took a step forward, and his voice, choked, broke the silence. "I can't change the past. I failed you. I failed Anna, I failed myself. But what I feel now is real. If you give me a chance, I don't want to make up for it with money or grand gestures. I want to be present." Emily lowered her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The weight of choice burned within her. Forgiveness was possible, but it meant reopening wounds, risking trust again. Goodbye was safe, but it meant closing the door forever on a man who had changed, who now seemed truly human. The silence lasted long seconds until she raised her face. Her voice was low but firm, charged with a calm that came from certainty. "I don't need you to save me, Michael. I've learned to survive without you, and that's why today I can choose. And I choose not to live trapped in the past, neither yours nor mine." He remained still, as if each word were a definitive sentence. Emily then reached out and lightly touched his face, a gesture more powerful than any statement. "It's not hate I feel, it's gratitude for finally understanding that I am whole on my own. Maybe one day I'll truly forgive, maybe even our stories will intersect again, but right now, I must go." The goodbye wasn't shouted, wasn't violent. It was said with the serenity of someone freeing themselves. Emily turned, walking to the library door. Michael remained still, his eyes fixed on her until the very last moment. And when the door closed, there was no anger or despair left, only the silent acceptance that this decision was poetic justice. He had learned. Too late, that true power lay not in conquering, but in letting go. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the horizon with golden hues that shone through the dusty window of the small library. Emily walked alone down the narrow street, her steps firm but light, as if finally releasing an old burden. In the distance, Michael stood before the closed door, not trying to follow her, simply watching her silhouette disappear among the simple houses. The previous night's rain still dripped down the sidewalks, reflecting the morning light like tiny, broken mirrors. Emily, turning a corner, paused for a moment before a flowering tree, the light wind scattering petals across the wet ground. She lifted her face and closed her eyes, feeling the breeze touch her skin as if it were a caress from her own mother. Across the street, Michael, alone, pulled a small old photo from his pocket, already yellowed with age. Anna, smiling, holding a small girl in her arms. He ran his thumb over the image, his eyes welling, before tucking it back into the inside pocket of his coat. There was no audience, no witnesses, only silence, heavy with all that remained unsaid. Emily continued on her way without looking back. Michael remained motionless, a man who had learned too late that certain promises require no reparation, only memory. The wind blew stronger, scattering the last petals across the ground, while the sun slowly rose, illuminating the emptiness between them. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.